A few months ago, I decided to play Pokemon X and Y again because I wanted to challenge my beliefs about the game. Many people, including myself in the Pokemon community, are of the opinion that X and Y are some of, if not the most disappointing games in the entire franchise, and that's probably part of the reason why they shocked everybody and announced a Legends game based on Gen 6. Anyways, the Gen 6 games' disappointment is incredible to think about, considering that the Generation 5 games are popularly held as some of the best games from the franchise. Now, I gathered many reasons for my dislike of these games over the course of my playthrough, but I really wanted to talk about one today, which is Team Flare. Let's be brutally honest here. Team Flare is the worst serious evil team in Pokemon. Who else is there? Team Yell? They're the video game version of this.
What do we think of Tottenham? What do we think of shit? Thank you!
So yeah, not serious. In fact, you could argue that Team Flare is the last ever serious evil team in Pokemon, probably because of how poorly they were received. If that's not an indictment of quality, I don't know what is. But either way, I want to dissect this team and explain why I think they're bad. I'll start with a quick recap on what they do in Pokemon X and Y, and then get into the main two reasons why they fall short: their lack of identity, and Lysander's botched writing job. Finally, I'll give some suggestions on how I would change Team Flare to make them a more convincing evil team. The story of Team Flare starts in Lumio City, way before the player even knows who Team Flare is. Here, they're introduced to an unmistakable man named Lysander. Here, in this initial meeting of the player and in the cafe where he's talking with Diantha, we learn a lot about the mysterious man's personality and values. We learn that he's the head of Lysander Labs, who developed the Holocaster, and we learn about his desire for a beautiful world, which alerts the player to his strong value for those who add value to the world, whether that be through Diantha's acting on the screen or his contributions from the Holocaster. There's also a little hint that this dude might be a little overboard in terms of his ideals, but we'll get back to him later. Up next is the first official appearance of Team Flare in Glittering Cave. Along with being introduced to their bright and bold outfits and poses, we find that they're trying to steal fossils. Once dispatched, the player next sees them on Route 10 around Geosenge Town, not as an active threat to the player, but as a passive participant in the environment, studying the oddly shaped rocks. And their final appearance before the return of Mr. Pyroar is in the Kalos power plant. The player finds out that the blackout in Lumio City is caused by Team Flare under the direction of the red scientist Aliana, who was siphoning energy from the plant. Back in Lumio City, we're treated to a meeting with the professor and Lysander, where we learn that the main man is a descendant of the King of Kalos who launched the ultimate weapon. But more importantly, we learn of Lysander's view on humanity. He sees the world as people who give and people who take. He's a person who gives, but those who take what isn't theirs are labeled as absolute filth. He finally ends with some mixed messaging about the king's decision to fire the ultimate weapon. But back to the bold fashionistas. We see them again at the Pokeball factory, where we also meet the purple and green scientist Thelucia and Brioni. But more importantly, Team Flare is here to steal Pokeballs, which they do so successfully apart from the Master Ball. And the final time we see them before the weapons are ultimated is in the Frost Cavern, where we meet the final female scientist, the blue one named Mabel, who's trying to catch a powerful Abomasnow. As a footnote to the build-up of the story, Lysander is also in constant contact with the player through the use of the Holocaster. And in his final meeting with the player, he actually broadcasts himself to the entire Kalos region, introducing himself as the leader of Team Flare. And in this meeting, he announces that they will use the ultimate weapon to basically restart the world. This sends the player first to Lysander Labs, where they battle the Doomer and learn that he feels like he tried to save the world through the creation of the Holocaster, and that the world and its filth can only be saved by using the ultimate weapon. The player then goes through the labs, and on the next floor finds a Z, and then on the next floor runs into Xerosic, the final Flare scientist. After beating him in battle, you get to press a button, but that doesn't really matter. After clearing the labs, the player travels to Geosenge Town to invade the not-so-secret Team Flare base. Here, the player battles Mr. Pyroar for the second time and learns that he believes that Pokemon should no longer exist, as they will be used for evil by the filthy humans. The player then goes through an admin gauntlet and captures a legendary Pokemon, only to battle the now fully desperate Lysander in one final showdown. In the end, the weapon gets fired once and destroys itself, and for all intents and purposes for this video, that is the end of Team Flare. Now we'll look at one of the main reasons why I don't like Team Flare, which is their lack of identity, specifically without Mr. Pyroar himself, Lysander. Which is not the worst thing in the world until you understand that Lysander is not part of Team Flare until the very end of the game. I'll talk about Lysander not joining the team until late in the game in a little bit, but first I want to focus on their identity without Lysander first. So to start, what is identity to an evil Pokemon team? For that, I want to look at other teams from other games. My first example is always going to be Team Plasma, and I'd say that their identity, at least in Pokemon Black and White, is that they want to liberate all Pokemon from their trainers, even if that isn't actually their real goal. And beyond that, it's the connection the player makes with N and the coldness of Getsus. In Ruby and Sapphire, Team Magma and Aqua have an absolute obsession with the land and sea respectively, and they're willing to go through hell or high water to achieve that. With those two examples, we have a combination of objectives, characters, and themes or motifs. And without Lysander, Team Flare maybe has one of these, and we'll start with that, with themes. I would say that fashion is a very strong theme or motif of Team Flare, from their grunts to their admins to their scientists. They have a very distinct look and style. The bright orange is very bold, and their scientists also have bright and bold hair colors. Finally, the grunts have the pose, which not all of you may remember, but it's always stuck in my head. So visually, yes, they're very distinct, but let's compare Team Flare's theme of fashion to Team Magma and Aqua's theme of land and water. Those two things are at the center of each team's objective, and it impacts everything they do throughout Ruby and Sapphire. Now, compare that to Team Flare, where fashion doesn't really impact anything they do. Yeah, sure, they look cool, but they would be the same team if they pulled up in a wife beater and athletic shorts. When you take the land and water away from Team Aqua and Magma, they would lose pretty much everything they stand for. My point here is that the main theme or motif for an evil team should really influence what they stand for and what they do throughout the game, and Team Flare just does not meet that at all. Now, these next two categories are impacted a lot by the absence of Lysander. Let's first talk about Team Flare's characters. Again, outside of Lysander, they don't really have anybody. I mean, they have the scientists, but they're just not memorable at all. I bet you can't even remember any of the female scientists' names, even though I just told you them a little bit ago. The player sees each of these scientists once before Lysander shows up, and they're all just so devoid of character and have so little dialogue that they're completely unmemorable. How are players supposed to be at least familiar with a character when they each only have like 10 lines of dialogue throughout the majority of the game? Again, compare this to Gen 5, where the player sees the same character, N or Zinzalin, multiple times throughout the game, so they end up remembering them. For Team Flare, it becomes really difficult to believe that they're going to be a threat when we don't actually get to see what any of their scientists are about. Finally, let's look at Team Flare's objectives. And again, without Lysander, they don't have any. Without any objective, even if it's fake, there's nothing that links their appearances together. And really, it's not that we need to know exactly what an evil team is going to do, but I think you need to have an inkling of an idea, which we just straight up don't with Team Flare. With other evil teams, we understand that they're looking into a legendary Pokemon or something dangerous about the region at an early enough point to where even if they are not otherwise that intimidating, there still is a perceived threat from them. Look at Team Galactic, for example. We learn that they're researching space and time and looking into the legendary Pokemon of the Sinnoh region by the time you beat the second gym. So throughout Diamond and Pearl, the player can feel the threat of Team Galactic working towards something big, even if we don't know that Cyrus leads the team until later. But with Team Flare, we don't get that connection with an objective or a legendary Pokemon at all until Lysander joins. Until then, Team Flare really has no objective and therefore no threatening presence whenever they show up in the game. Of course, having an objective or identity isn't the only way to feel threatening in a game, but Team Flare falls short in other ways that would improve their threat level in my eyes. One of the things that I will always look at in terms of how convincing something is in a video game is in general how the world reacts to events, people, and more. And in the context of Team Flare, the world around them does not perceive them as a threat, and I have a few examples to drive this point home. The second time the player ever sees Team Flare is on Route 10, right before Geosenge Town, where all the mysterious rocks are located. Now, if Team Flare was actually a threat, you would think that all the other people on the route would probably want to scram before they get in trouble with them. But we really don't see that happen. In fact, we see tourists examining the same rocks that Team Flare are. If that's not an indictment on how people perceive Team Flare as not threatening, then I don't know what is. For another example, right after you dip out of the Antistar City gym, Lysander makes an announcement to everyone via the Holocaster. In this moment, he literally says that Team Flare are going to wipe the slate clean and then bids adieu to everyone. And now, with one of the most powerful people in the region as their leader, you would think that people would have to be a lot more worried now, but they aren't. Other than Serena directing the player back to Lumio City, none of the other people in Antistar City seem to change at all. Personally, I would think the entire region would become hysterical if they were told that they were all going to die, but that doesn't happen. Instead, everyone is going about their day like nothing happened. This specific moment, in my opinion, loses so much credibility for Team Flare because in what ends up being their most triumphant moment in the entire game, nobody cares. And of course, this isn't really an issue with Team Flare itself, it's more an issue with Pokemon X and Y, but it ends up reflecting extremely poorly on Team Flare. And before we take a look at Lysander himself, there's one last little thing that I want to point out. And that is, even with their objective of using the legendary Pokemon to fire the ultimate weapon, some of their appearances don't even make sense, or at the very least, they're very poorly explained in how they connect to Team Flare's objectives. I think I'll cut them some slack for their first appearance in Glittering Cave, as the player's just getting to know the vibe of Team Flare, even though I would say it makes no sense for them to be examining fossils. Maybe they need the fossils' fuels to power the ultimate weapon, but I honestly think that's a stretch. Team Flare's appearances on Route 10, the power plant, and the Pokeball factory do make sense to me, but then it's all thrown away in Frost Cavern. Well, I do feel like this interaction was rushed and it's not what the developers originally intended to have here. I don't understand them wanting to investigate a powerful wild Pokemon, especially so late in their team's development. At that point, they should really just be putting on the finishing touches to the ultimate weapon. To me, this appearance really feels like the developers wanted to have one more Team Flare appearance before everything went down, and while I agree with that sentiment, surely there was a better idea than what they went with. But whatever. I think everyone here knows this story really makes or breaks itself with Lysander. After all, he's the only guy on Team Flare that anybody remembers at all. So naturally, they think of him when they think of the story of Pokemon X and Y. But when I think of Lysander, I think of a poorly written character. I do think there's the basis of a good villain here, but it's not executed well. And I think it starts with how his effectiveness as a villain is based on getting the player to sympathize with him and his cause. He wants the player to feel the same way about his stance on making the world more beautiful and adding value to the world. If he can get the player on board with him, and most importantly, if he can get the player to trust him and to trust how he wants to achieve this goal, then the player is not an obstacle in his path to fire the ultimate weapon. But even more importantly, from a game design standpoint, the player would become more emotionally attached to Lysander, which makes Lysander a more convincing villain. And I hope I don't need to explain why being more emotionally attached to a villain makes them more convincing. However, Lysander is not written sympathetically. Actually, he's written at a distance and with a coldness that is the opposite of what would be needed to have the player sympathize with him. Let's look at a few examples which prove this. at least to me. Of course, everyone interprets things in different ways, but I'm going to explain to you how I interpret these things and why I think they show that Lysander is not sympathetic to the player. So this first scene comes when the player has just beaten Clement in Lumio City and goes to have a word with Lysander in his cafe. I was just having a conversation with Lysander about Mega Evolution. I would like to congratulate you as well. Mega Evolution is something I too would like to be able to use. Actually, Lysander himself is of royal ancestry. He truly is a chosen one. True, I'm a descendant of the king's younger brother. That being said, that story is 3,000 years old, so it might not be entirely reliable. By the way, do you know where the Holocaster is made? That's right, they're made in Lysander's lab. Lysander is a great man. He supports trainers and Pokemon research with some of the profit from the Holocaster. People can be divided into two groups, those who give and those who take. It's just as how the Kalos region's two legendary Pokemon gave life and took life. I want to be the kind of person who gives. But in this world, some foolish humans exist who would show their strength by taking what isn't theirs. They're filth! Long ago, the king of Kalos sought to take everything for his own, and he created a terrible weapon. Then the fire of destruction was unleashed. That is the legend that has been passed down. Kalos is beautiful right now. There will be no foolish actions if the number of people and Pokemon do not increase. That being said, the future is not decided. You can't be sure each day will be like the one before. What the King of Kalos did was reprehensible, but the ultimate weapon did manage to wash the world clean of that era's filth. I want you to notice how almost the entire conversation is centered around Lysander's talking points and his interests. At first, mostly because he's in the middle of a conversation with Sycamore, he congratulates the player on their ability to use Mega Evolution, as that's something that he would also like to be able to use. That's a normal part of conversation, the give and take, if you will. But then, with an assist from Sycamore, he goes into a full-on tirade of the people of Kalos and how the ultimate weapon was almost a necessity to essentially reset the Kalos region. All of this is centered around his thoughts, his ideas, and his opinions. None of this has to do with the player. And for me, being lectured at and not included in a conversation is a good way for me to begin to zone out and completely disregard that person. Wait, what do you mean that's exactly what I'm doing? You're the one who clicked on a video essay. So not the objective if you're Lysander trying to get the player on your side. Lysander also comes off as really judgy in this conversation, especially when he's talking about the people of Kalos. Even though he's judging those supposedly bad people, the tone and passion of which he's talking about these people, it just does not sit right with me. And I'm sure someone's like, but Cade, he's having a conversation with the player who doesn't even speak. Of course he's only going to talk about himself. And sure, you have a point, but this next example of him is having a conversation with an actual person, the champion actually, Diantha. Let's take a look at what he says here. You played a young girl so wonderfully in your debut on the silver screen. Wouldn't you rather remain young and beautiful forever and always play such roles? What a strange question. Why would I want to play the same old roles forever? Youth may be beautiful, but it's not all there is to life. Everything changes. I want to live and change like that too. So I look forward to playing different roles as I get older. You were chosen to be a movie star, correct? Isn't it your duty to be ever beautiful? Everything beautiful should stay that way forever. I would end the world in an instant so that beauty never fades. I can't stand the thought of the world becoming uglier. Oh, hello. This is Diantha, one of the most accomplished movie stars in Kalos. She moves the multitudes with her excellent acting, which is to say she dedicates her life to making other people happy. Oh, if only everyone were like her. What a beautiful world this would be, if you'll excuse me. Now, completely disregarding Lysander talking like an absolute creep here, to his credit, he is talking about Diantha for some of the conversation and not himself. But if we examine this interaction closer, we see that he's just talking about Diantha to talk about himself and his opinions. He brings up her beauty to then ask what he thinks is a rhetorical question because he thinks that everyone would want to stay beautiful forever. But then Diantha flips the script on him, saying that she wants to change just like everyone else. Lysander is shocked at that answer and completely changes the conversation to center around him and his beliefs. He wants a beautiful world forever, and Diantha does not get another word in the conversation until Lysander leaves. In 2 examples now, we see Lysander making everything about himself. This is going to do the opposite of what he wants. Because the player sees that he's selfish and frankly not a good conversationalist, it's likely that his selfishness will extend beyond just talking. So then later, when Lysander might want the player to side with him, the player is naturally not going to want to do that, even if Lysander is morally right. Now, there are other ways that someone can make connection with a player. If the quality of conversation is not there, then maybe the quantity of conversation can make up for that. And we see Lysander try and do that a few times with the Holocaster, but these interactions are not good either. Take this one from Coumarine City, for example. Professor Sycamore told me you can now wield Mega Evolution. That is truly wonderful. With that power, you can steer your future in a better direction. We can't just cover up the old filth with new filth. I implore you to consider what we need to do to change the world into a new, beautiful world. This one's probably the best because he's talking a little about the player, but then shifts that to his own focus about having a beautiful world. But the point that I want to make here is that the Holocaster meetings just feel like lectures. There's no give and take here. A lecture is not a good way to get to know somebody or to sympathize with them, especially when the points he's making are confusing at best and dystopic at worst. But okay, not all games have a sympathetic villain. Lysander could be good outside of that sphere, right? And that's true, he could be. But the other thing that I'm not a fan of with Lysander is that he straight up goes against his own values and beliefs. What are those values though, you ask? Well, let's go back to that encounter we have in Lysander Cafe. We learn of his hatred of the filth of humanity and the Kalos region, which is those who take what is not theirs. This comes after his view of the 2 types of people in the world, those who give and those who take. He views himself as someone that gives. After all, he did give the Holocaster to the region. But what becomes Lysander's endgame? To fire the ultimate weapon and to wipe the slate clean. We later get a better understanding of what he means by this in their secret hideout, where he reveals to the player and their rival that everyone except Team Flare will be eliminated, including Pokemon. So by getting rid of essentially everyone in Kalos, he's getting rid of a lot of people and things that he values in the Kalos region. For example, Diantha, the shining example he shows to the player at the beginning of the game, someone who we see get complimented by Lysander, is not part of Team Flare, and therefore she would no longer exist. Some of that beauty he clearly loves just gone like that. On top of that, Pokemon themselves will not exist. Just like Diantha, Pokemon provide so much beauty to the world in his eyes, so it just doesn't make sense to get rid of them. And in a more general sense, we get the impression that there are only some people that are filth that take from the world. To me, this implies that most people are good in his eyes. So by getting rid of everyone, he's going to get rid of more good people than bad. In my eyes, getting rid of all these good people to get rid of some bad people is nowhere near a valid enough reason to fire the ultimate weapon. And if we take this thought experiment one step further, across the player's entire journey in Kalos, when do we see the filth that Lysander is talking about? Throughout the average player's experience, we only see this happen when the player is running into Team Flare. But if you really looked into every nook and cranny, I could count on my hands the amount of bad people there are in Kalos that don't have a red suit on. So really, it's only Team Flare. So if we follow this logic by only saving Team Flare and getting rid of everything else, Lysander is literally only keeping the filth around and is getting rid of all the good people, which is in direct opposition to his goals and values. Now, in my eyes, there is one way where Lysander acting like this makes sense, and though I'm not sure that I believe this theory myself, I do want to entertain the idea here for a few moments. And that is, what if Lysander is a psychopath? And I think it makes a lot of sense. But before we get into it, just quick disclaimer, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm gonna do the best to explain with the knowledge that I have. But I also passed this by my sister who is in psychology, and she said this made sense. The first thing to point out before we really dive into this is that psychopathy is not actually a diagnosable illness. Rather, psychopathic behavior can fall under the larger umbrella that is antisocial personality disorder. So I'll look at the aspects of that. The first aspect of this is, of course, being antisocial. Lysander, despite being a central character in the story, could be interpreted as being more of a loner, as it's alluded to that he was pretty much solely responsible for the creation of the Holocaster. So it could be the case that he's antisocial and only interacts with people when he needs to. The next aspect that I want to look at is a disregard and violation of others' rights through aggressive and destructive behavior without remorse or loyalty to anyone. And here Lysander passes with flying colors. He literally wants to destroy Kalos because he thinks it makes the world a better place. So you have the destructive behavior and the dissociation of guilt because he thinks it's going to make the world a better place. The other point of antisocial personality disorder that I think just fits his character perfectly is that the disorder is mainly characterized through conflict with others, low frustration tolerance, inadequate conscience development, and rejection of authority and discipline. I think the example of Lysander and Diantha that I showed earlier is a perfect example of this. In ordinary conversation, he's conflicting with the other party and is clearly frustrated when he doesn't hear what he wants to hear. I think there's an assumption that people with psychopathy come with the inability to be stable, which is normally seen in like a job or family life, but psychopaths can actually be stable. So it seems that Lysander is a perfect candidate for antisocial personality disorder, right? Well, here's where it gets a little murky. Remember when Lysander says that Pokemon will no longer exist? In that moment, he cries. And while I think in popular culture, psychopaths are characterized as being ruthless and unemotional, that is not part of the official classification. So I think some people can see this moment as being what proves that Lysander is not a psychopath. But then I think others could see this as Lysander struggling to understand and process his thoughts and the incoming reality that Pokemon could no longer exist. Well, that was a long look at Team Flare, and now that we've dissected every fiber of their being, we know why they're disappointing. But what if we made Team Flare a good team? A convincing team? What would that look like? Now, based on the previous section on psychopathy, you could just say if Lysander doesn't cry, this fixes Lysander. And yes, it would make him make sense, but in my eyes, it would not make Lysander a convincing villain, and it certainly doesn't fix Team Flare. So we're gonna have to change a little bit more. And of course, this is all my opinion. I would love to hear in the comments what you all would do to make Team Flare better, but I'm gonna try and make as little change as possible with the largest amount of improvement. So the biggest change in my eyes is that right when you meet Lysander, he tells you he's the leader of Team Flare. But in this scenario, Team Flare, which probably also gets renamed, is the company responsible for creating the Holocaster under the leadership of Lysander and is generally seen as a good organization by the people of Kalos. This way, it's not viewed as suspicious of Lysander to be in such a team, and it gives Team Flare an excuse for being anywhere in the region for research purposes. And by Lysander being on Team Flare right away, it gives the rest of the team that defined objective that they are otherwise missing, because Lysander is still looking for answers for making the Kalos region a better place. Maybe in this scenario, Lysander is more direct about his disappointment that the Holocaster hasn't had as positive of an effect in Kalos that he was hoping for, and he's looking for another way to improve the region. That way, there is an explanation for each of the Team Flare appearances, as they could be doing research or putting their secret plan of action in motion. Essentially, there's a face to their wrongdoings, and Lysander could explain that away, such as deflecting blame to his scientists or by saying it's necessary for this new secret plan that he has. And this is where the other big change of Lysander comes in. Somehow, some way in the writing, the player needs to be sympathetic towards him. Whether he's explaining his cause in a way that the player understands and is inspired by, or if the region actually has examples of the type of people that Lysander hates, the player needs to understand the cause of Team Flare and maybe maybe even agree with them. That way, the player and the world around them can be more understanding when Team Flare causes the blackout in Lumio City or raids the Pokeball factory. What I'm really trying to do here is to make Team Flare have a constant face and a constant force that is identifiable and understandable throughout the game. The player's not just confused at a general entity. Instead, they can be upset because of what they're doing and why they're doing. Now, for me at least, I think the end of the game is a lot more open. I do enjoy the devolvement of Lysander into insanity, and I think that becomes even better in this altered version of Team Flare with the player theoretically caring for Lysander. I think one interesting aspect that I haven't touched on at all in this video though could be Professor Sycamore. Supposedly, he is close with Lysander and is surprisingly absent from the climax of the story, so if it makes sense, it could be interesting to see him thrown into the mix somewhere, perhaps trying to be a voice of reason to an already insane Lysander. And finally, I think there needs to be some more involvement of the scientists somewhere in the story. While I like 06's role, the other scientists are just so unmemorable. Whether their role in their respective early appearances is a little more impactful in terms of personality, or if they play a larger role in the endgame, any more presence here would be much appreciated. I want to be clear though that this version of the story is not completely error-free, nor have I put enough thought into this altered story to where I'd be confident switching the story of X and Y to this, but I am confident that these small changes throughout the game would make Team Flare and Pokemon X and Y better. Before we conclude, I want to thank all of you who got through this long video on an evil team that I believe probably doesn't even deserve an analysis like this. This is also my first foray into video essay type content, so if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. But overall, I really do think Team Flare's disappointment and overall standing in the Pokemon evil team hierarchy is a product of their lack of identity without Lysander and Lysander's troublesome writing and character. And in an abbreviated thought experiment of fixing them, those are the two problems that I tried to hit the hardest. I really do think that if Lysander wasn't written like your least favorite college professor, there's a chance that he would be remembered much more fondly. And a similar thing to Team Flare as a whole. If they weren't voids inside of flashy suits, they might have been less of a disappointment. But I really hope this video not only made you think about Team Flare, but also other evil teams in Pokemon and other villains in general. I think that this lack of identity is a problem that many other villains have trouble with, and it ends up affecting their games in a negative way. But that's all from me today. This is Caterade5 signing out. Thanks for watching, everybody, and have yourselves a good day.